Sidon, 5,000 years.
The British Museum has been excavating in the Middle East for well over 150 years. But what is going on in Sidon at the moment is certainly one of the most important of our modern excavations. It's led by Claude Dumay, and under her guidance, the museum has been able to carry out this major excavation in Lebanon, which for us is a very important engagement with contemporary archaeology. When I visited the site in Sidon, I was able to see for myself the steady revelation of layer after layer, each layer showing a different kind of contact, a different kind of local culture, but above all, a different set of exchanges from Sidon with the other great cultures of the Middle East. It allows us, looking down at that excavation, to see across the centuries, across the millennia indeed, at what is actually being thought, made and traded across the whole of the ancient Middle East. And that is very, very important for the British Museum and indeed for anyone interested in the history of Lebanon to understand.
Like many other cities in the Levant, Sidon has been continuously inhabited over the centuries. This makes it particularly difficult to uncover the physical evidence of its history. Until recently, what we knew of ancient Sidon came from ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian and Greek records, as well as the Old Testament. Sidon lies between the sea and a narrow fertile plain, irrigated by numerous streams and rivers, originating from neighbouring hills and mountains. On their journeys south to Jerusalem or north to Damascus, writers through the ages have described with great enthusiasm the fertility and beauty of the lush greenery which framed the city. It has a natural harbour protected by a chain of small islands and reefs. The medieval walled city continues to thrive with its narrow alleys and tiny shop fronts, whilst the 21st century encroaches further and further into the surrounding small family holdings that have characterized the city since time immemorial. Two castles mark the limit of this medieval metropolis. The Saint-Louis land castle, built on an ancient mound, and the Crusader sea castle, built during the winter of 1227 to 1228, on a rocky outpost in the middle of the sea, and still accessible by a solid stone bridge. By 1872, Sidon had become a prosperous merchant city and an outpost to the American Protestant mission, who built a school on the slope of Sidon's ancient mound. During foundation work for the construction of their new college, marble remains were found. Amongst these was a marble proton capital of two bulls crouching back to back. It was thought by some that this may have been the area of a pleasure garden of the Persian period, the Apadana of Sidon, as mentioned by Diodorus of Sicily. The mound area was eventually expropriated by the Lebanese Department of Antiquities as a site of major interest and remained untouched until 1998, when the British Museum began its excavation.
The British Museum's involvement in Sidon actually dates back to 1997. Just before that, we'd had a very successful exhibition here in the museum about Beirut Uncovering the Past, which focused on the rescue excavations in Beirut. This was a terrific success, attracted a lot of interest, and we were then invited by the Lebanese Department of Antiquities to participate in an excavation in Lebanon. So in 1997, I and a colleague, Carol Mendelssohn, went to Lebanon together with Claude Dumais and other Lebanese colleagues. We looked at a number of sites in Lebanon and decided that Sidon would be the most profitable place for an excavation. This is really because Sidon's one of the most important sites. Well, we're very pleased to be sponsoring this excavation, and it very much is a joint project between the Lebanese Department of Antiquities and the British Museum, directed by Dr. Claude Dumais-Serhal. And we very much see this sort of collaboration as being the way forward in the Middle East, working closely together with the authorities in the host country. And I have to say, this arrangement has proved to be enormously successful. Also, Dr. Dumais has done some work in the vicinity of the ancient harbour. She's taken some cores from the sediments in that area and established the outline of the ancient harbour.
Previous excavations at the site of Dakaman, just 1 kilometre to the south, showed that although the earliest settled inhabitants of Sidon lived there in roundhouses during the Chalcolithic period, at some point at the beginning of the early Bronze Age, in the 3rd millennium BC, they moved north to the site currently being excavated, which was in fact closer to Sidon's natural harbour. From the ongoing excavation, 6 levels of early Bronze Age occupation have been found, the earliest of which sits on the sandstone bedrock. From around 3000 BC, there is a slow and steady growth in urban development and commercial activity and trade. Pottery found on site imported from Egypt, and an increase in the production of jars made for export, testify to the ancient city's expanding international trade. A close connection also existed with the northern city-state of Byblos. This is shown by the discovery of a jug with a figure of a ram on the rim, similar to a twin cult vessel found in Byblos, as well as the discovery of cylinder seal impressions with similar themes to those also found in Byblos. The full flowering of the early Bronze Age at Sidon saw the development of large buildings used for storage and domestic activities. A large mud brick building which was destroyed in a fire was excavated. A large number of jars were found on its floor very near a narrow storage space or bin. Also, there were distinct traces of burning on the floor of some rooms. One area commonly assumed to be a cooking area had a basalt basin, a limestone quern in a distinctive curved shape, and a basalt mortar full of blackened ashy soil. The 2007 excavation season uncovered the building's rectangular storerooms, which had completely burnt down. These were built of mud brick and contained some pottery and mainly burnt wheat. Over 160 kilograms of charred grain were uncovered so far in the rooms, as well as a layer of plaster which covered the floor of the rooms and sealed the heaps of grain, most probably to repel rodents and insects. In general, storage facilities are centrally located and situated in a position that would serve the community. Furthermore, these facilities lie in the vicinity of Sidon's harbour, where loading and unloading of commodities took place. Quite a number of whole-mouth jars were found on the site. This indicates that Sidon was a centre of mass production for these utilitarian jars, found throughout the Levant. The excavation also produced an abundance of animal remains, some of them quite unexpected. Although around half were of domesticated bovine or ovine species, the rest were of wild animals, hunted as food. These included deer, wild boar, aurochs, hippopotamus, lion and bear. What is surprising is that hunting for food was not common in the southern Levant at this time, because domesticated species were being bred efficiently enough to cover the city's meat supplies. Nevertheless, there are numerous signs of butchering on the hippopotamus remains. These include cut marks made by knives and marks typical of chopping with axes. This means that there can be no doubt that at Sidon the hippopotami were quartered, chopped or cut into pieces, skinned and eaten. The absence of any skulls suggests that they were removed and processed elsewhere, perhaps in an industrial area where the bone and ivory would be used as decorative elements. The characteristics of the chase, however, give pause for reflection. The game selected is uncharacteristic of hunters looking only for meat. If that had been the objective, they would not have sought out the most dangerous animals, such as the males of redoubtable species. One explanation for this may be ideological or religious, rather than economical. This type of hunting may imply that the hunt was about prestige. For example, part of the process of choosing a leader, or perhaps it reflected the existence of a separate social group made up of specialist hunters. Immediately above the early Bronze Age lay a thick layer of sand which had deliberately been laid there. This sand extends across the area so far excavated, indicating a change of function in the use of the site. At the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, around the 2nd millennium BC, this part of the site developed as a cemetery. 60 burials have so far been found, some of the earliest of which were constructed graves dug into the sand. These were mainly of warriors buried with weapons, pottery and animal offerings, and child burials with weapon and jewellery. Such weapons do not represent the military equipment of armies, but that of an elite. They are symbols of the heroic warrior, occurring at the beginning of the 2nd millennium throughout Western Asia. The axes were generally found lying behind or near the skull, which indicates that they were carried resting on the shoulder. One axe is unique in that it has a false socket with a knob on either side. Because of this, it had no practical use. It had probably been used for ceremonial purposes, or as a sign of rank. One grave held a skeleton, nicknamed the Silver Man, because of the abundance of silver with which he was adorned. There was a silver band around his head, silver studs lay in a circle around the axe head, and he wore a silver belt and silver bracelets, along with a more usual array of grave goods. Analysis of this silver has established that the most likely source of the silver artifacts found in this grave were the central Taurus Mountains in Anatolia. The building of constructed graves continued into the second part of the 19th century BC. We also see the appearance of child burials in jars with scarabs, beads, and pottery vessels. Only one arrowhead was found in the jar burial of a 13-year-old juvenile. The neck and shoulder of the jar was usually broken and removed in order to insert the deceased with the head often placed at the base of the jar. The burials were either primary or secondary. This means that the body had decomposed elsewhere, and only then were some long bones and the skull placed in a jar and buried. One constructed grave contained the remains of a 15-month-old child, together with disarticulated adult bones. A bronze knife with a hoof-shaped handle had been placed on top of animal bones. Though well preserved, the knife was not robust enough to have been a weapon, and is instead associated with the presence of meat offerings in the grave.
For the past 5 years, the bones from Sidon have been sent to me every year for my analysis and for me to report and to get as much information as I possibly can from what are very often very fragmentary remains. I thought I'd talk about what happens to these skeletons once they've been excavated in Sidon, and when they've been carefully retrieved, carefully packaged and flown over to us. And to show you some of the work that we do, I've laid out one of the better preserved skeletons from Sidon. you can see there's still quite a lot missing. This skeleton is actually quite well preserved. Well, the first and most interesting thing that we as human beings are interested in is a male or a female. And that's the other reason for showing you this particular skeleton, because she's very unusual. This is one of the few women who've been found in the Sidon excavation. If we start looking at the skull, you can see what are called the brow ridges above the eyes, where the eyebrows are. They're quite thin and sharp, whereas with a man they're much more rounded and more rugged. It's the pelvis that shows the biggest difference. Now, we know that she was a mature female because there is no sign anywhere that the bones are still growing. She's at least 25. The bone that we use most for assessing the age of individuals is what is called the pubic symphysis. With young individuals, this surface is rough and rippled. Now, there's no sign on these bones to indicate that she died a violent death, but what we can tell from the skeleton is that she'd had a very hard life, that she was working physically very hard. And the reason we know that is by looking at the muscle attachments. Everywhere that the muscles attach to the bones, if someone is working hard for their living, they produce a lip of bone, showing that a lot of tension and a lot of pull has gone on there. And then when we look at the vertebrae, because of this slight flaring of the bodies of the vertebrae, you can see that she was carrying a lot of vertical load. And one thing in particular confirms this. If we look at the cervical vertebrae, in other words the neck vertebrae, what we find is that two of them are actually pinched and squashed. So we know that this lady too carried very heavy weights on her head, and in this period the most likely thing is that she was carrying large jars of water high above her head. This again confirms that this woman was used to hard physical work, because you can see osteoarthritis of one of the joints of her thumb. You can see these little lips of bone here, which are a response to severe loading. I've talked about how badly preserved many of the adults at Sidon are, but the other side of the coin is that many of the children from Sidon are amazingly well preserved. This skeleton is that of a neonate, in other words, a baby that was stillborn and was buried in a jar. And you can get some idea of how tiny these bones are, and yet these bones have survived for 3,000 years. Again, you can see the amazing ability of the hands to survive. But one of the things that impresses particularly with this skeleton are the parts of the skull. Here is what is called the sphenoid bone, which is a very complicated bone right in the middle of everybody's skull. But here it is in a newborn baby before it's fused to anything else. And you can see the amount of fine detail